So, what is this Modo thing anyway? Well, these days, I think it's fair to say that Modo is a general-purpose digital content creation program, in the same league, if not exactly feature-for-feature comparable to a Maya or a Cinema 4D. Really, a lot of the expected boxes for your general-purpose program have been checked. Modo began with really strong polygon and subdivision surface modeling tools, and from there they've added on things like sculpting and painting tools, there's a rigging and animation toolset, there are rigid and soft body dynamics, there's a procedural particle system, which I think is quite fun to work with. There's a nodal programming system underlying a lot of this that allows you to rig almost anything to almost anything else and do cool stuff. The render engine is really quite good, even in the league of some standalone products, and the whole mess is Python scriptable. So, taken as a whole, really, Modo these days is a general-purpose program. So, does the world really need yet another application to do many of the same things as Maya or Cinema 4D? Well, I think there's room to give it a try, in part just because this is a different application. If you consider the great Venn diagram of 3D software, there are definitely some edge cases where one tool or another is the only game in town. But in the middle, where there's a lot of overlap, it gets very hard to make a call as to what's the best tool for the job. I think it's a lot more relevant to ask what's the best tool for the artist. I believe that as humans, all our brains work a little differently, so if there's a tool that approaches common tasks in a different way, there will be a subset of artists that find that a quicker or more comfortable way to work. That said, Modo's developers have put a lot of work into being approachable by a lot of different kinds of artists. For example, most important tools have both an icon and a text label. There are redundant ways of finding most features: keyboard shortcuts, context menus, pie menus, tear-off menus, regular old top-of-the-application menus, and lots of ways to customize your setup. So they're really trying. I find Modo a better match for my learning style than some other software I've worked with. But what else is good? I'm particularly fond of what I would call Modo's direct approach to modeling. At the moment, there's no equivalent of procedural or parametric modeling. There's no modeling history or modifier stack like C4D or Max or Maya or Houdini. Instead, there are these direct fire and forget type tools that let you grab stuff and just mash it around. For some users, this is definitely a pain point, but I really like it. It reminds me of working with clay. It's very immediate, very tactile, and supports what I would call sort of an improvisational approach. You can work without a plan or a net. I'd say modeling in Modo has a lot in common with sculpting, where modeling in Cinema 4D, for example, has a lot in common with rigging. So it is a different way of working. It's not to say you can't do some clever things with Modo's rigging tools if you want to have an adjustable model. Just for now, no mesh edits. Another area where I find Modo's toolset really useful is in generating complexity. Modo's replicators are a lightweight render-time geometry instancing system that lets you do things like Maya's XGen, but with much friendlier controls. So for rigging up very complex scenes that approach, biological complexity, this is a really handy toolset. The replication controls work just like rigging controls, which work just like particle system controls. In fact, that's a big enough deal that I would call it a feature in itself. With the possible exception of mesh fusion, the core technologies of Modo all work together and all make sense together. In Maya, if you get very good at using nucleus dynamics, that does you no good for understanding XGen, and knowing XGen is no help when it comes to setting up Bifrost. In Modo, if you know how to wire up a deformer, you can use the same wiring system to set up a particle system, or plug that into rigid body dynamics. Taken by themselves, there's certainly cases where the individual tools in Modo aren't as capable as the equivalents in some other software. But the ease of mashing them all together can still enable some pretty cool stuff. Another major feature for the why Modo discussion would have to be the render engine. Unlike the engines that you find in the box with some other content creation packages, the Modo render is capable of serious work. The results you can get are comparable to standalone production renderers. V-Ray ends up being mentioned frequently, as there is a certain similarity of approach there. I don't think it's reasonable to declare a priori that one renderer or another is the best thing out there, but the Modo renderer is certainly not a built-in handicap that you're going to have to replace before you try real work. One reason for that may be that half the founding team is really focused on the render engine. It's a bit like a hot rod. They're always tinkering with things. In every version, you find that something has been updated, optimized, or refined. For the 901 cycle, there's a new surface shading system and a lot of light sampling updates. Under the hood, it's a CPU-based renderer. If you think of CPU renderers as flexible and GPU renderers as fast, then Modo will be surprisingly fast. But it's also very adaptable. There's a lot of control to develop your own look, from photoreal to completely abstract. The renderer takes advantage of big memory and clever coding that's not always possible on a GPU, and can also take advantage of spare hardware to a certain extent. The bucket renderer is distributable, so you can have multiple machines working on a single frame or a series of frames. But the built-in network rendering system has been a sore point lately. A lot of the bugs from the 801 cycle have been fixed, but it's still a little touchy to set up. And if you're depending on having a local render farm, this is one area where a third-party tool may be necessary. Back on the plus side, the defaults and presets are quite good. A lot of thought has gone into what controls are exposed and what the default settings are, so it doesn't take endless tweaking to get to an acceptable starting look. And while you are tweaking, the feedback is very fast. The progressive preview renderer is an alternate implementation of the same rendering code, so the look ends up identical to what you would get with a bucket renderer. At this point, it can do basically everything but caustics. Really quick, really accurate feedback makes it a lot easier to match the pixels in the screen to the vision in your head. Finally, if you aren't getting the results that you need from the built-in renderer, third-party support is growing. There are plugins for Maxwell and Octane, and V-Ray has been in public beta for actually about a year at this point. You can also export your work to industry formats like Alembic or FBX or OBJ if all else fails, and render with the tools of your choice. So, with all that said, software is software, and none of it is perfect. If you are considering using Modo, there are some reasons to consider not using Modo. One of them is if you are largely a character animator. In my work in science, it is extraordinarily rare that I have to rig up a biped and make it walk. But from people who do, I have heard that the IK solver in Modo is weak as these things go. It lacks some features that people expect to have in an IK solver. And while there are rigging kits and some really good rigging tutorials and a lot of really interesting things you can do with deformers and stuff, as rigs get more complex, performance is notably slow. Motion graphics with an asterisk, because it really does depend. If you are coming from Cinema 4D as a motion graphics artist, the lack of history, the lack of procedural geometry creation is going to crimp your style. There are things that you can do in Cinema 4D that you can't easily duplicate in Modo. Now, this is not to say that you can't do motion graphics with Modo. There certainly is a lot you can do. The particle system is really cool. The replicators are really cool. So you can do very cool motion graphics-y things. However, if you're expecting it to be Cinema 4D, it's not. So dynamics is another case where it does depend very much on what you're trying to do. Modo is not Houdini and it's not RealFlow. In some cases, it may be like 80% of Houdini for 20% of the price. But if you really need that last 20%, there are going to be things that you can't do in Modo. This is not to say that you shouldn't try dynamics in Modo. Certainly the control system is very artist-friendly, and you can do an awful lot with it. Modo is not a tool that you would leave Houdini for. At the other end of the scale, Modo is also not Blender. As more and more features have been added, the program has become more and more of a pipeline tool and less of a special case tool. It has gotten more expensive. And at this point, it is not the kind of thing that you would say, oh, here's a handy sculpting tool, let me throw it in my toolkit. Or here's a handy, you name it tool. It's not software that you would pick for a single feature at this point. It's a bigger decision than that. And it really would be the sort of thing where you should download an evaluation copy, do many tutorials, try some things, like the kind of thing you're thinking of trying with Modo. See if you like the way it works for you. And Modo is really fun in some ways. So let's look through and do some fun work with it. See what you think.